focused on cloud and co-location, data center industry trends, and dynamic market.
Hello everyone, this is Dan Scarborough here with Data Center Hawk. Very excited today. I'm joined with James Veness, who's the head of portfolio for data centers with Fujitsu Australia. Hi James, thanks for taking the time to talk to me today.
Yeah, hi Dan, nice to be here. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so very interested to speak to a Brit across the large pond. So for those of you that are listening, for those that are listening, can you just give a bit of background on Fujitsu, in particular the data center services side of the business, and yourself and what you guys are up to?
Yeah, well, hi everyone. Thanks, Dan. James Veness. Been in Australia now for 10 years, so you might hear from the accent. I'm a Pommy, as they call us over here. Been in the DC game for quite a long time. I've been at Fujitsu for about a year now, or just under a year, and I manage the one of the 7 portfolios, and the portfolio that I run is the data center services business here in Australia, or Oceania, as we call it. We have 6 sites in Australia. They kind of fit into 2 nice categories: our co-location sites, which operate in Perth, 2 in Sydney and Brisbane, and then we have our hyperscale sites, which is a buzzword of the market at the moment. Our flagship site is out in Western Sydney. That's a site up to 90 megawatts, very large hyperscale site in the Western Corridor, where most hyperscales put their large compute farms, and a secondary site down in Melbourne on the eastern side of the city, which is up to 30 megawatts. So quite a large footprint of data center space. The larger site's also mixed use as well, so we do co-location and hyperscale and wholesale customers out of those sites. And what's driving that is Fujitsu still has a heritage in the enterprise markets, because we still fulfill the rest of the Fujitsu business. As a DC team, we handle the wholesale and hyperscale customers directly within the DC business.
And in terms of the kind of the Fujitsu data center services business, is it exclusively in Oceania, or have you got sites across the rest of Asia as well?
Yeah, good question. So I'm only responsible for the Oceania business. I say Oceania, we only own and operate our own sites within Australia, and we have some partner arrangements in New Zealand. We have quite a big enterprise business in New Zealand, so we can see that potentially down the track that could be a strategy we might look at around expansion there. But today they're just in Australia. We are part of a global footprint of over 100 data centers, mainly focused around Japan, UK, Singapore's quite a lot of capability there, and then sort of dispersed around the world after that. But main capability in terms of DC owned and managed footprint is Australia, Japan, Singapore, and UK.
And how long are the assets? How long have you been in Australia with data center assets for?
Over 21 years, so quite a considerable amount of time. And when we start talking about circularity or life cycle management and how efficient these things are, I think it's all good talking about the brand new sites, and I'd love to talk to you about Western Sydney as well, which is our brand new site with the best designs. But we're also responsible to manage the current business, so making sure our data centers are always efficient, always being audited to ensure their impact is reduced, and make sure that you're delivering the service that's expected of the customers as of today's market, as opposed to yesterday's. But yeah, 21 years, long heritage in engineering, Fujitsu, and certifying data center service businesses.
And as one of the key players in the Australian data center industry, can you give us a bit of an indication around the development of Australia, and in particular Sydney, as a colo market over the last couple of years, and how you're kind of seeing that compared to maybe the wider APAC market?
Well, I think APAC and Australia, or also APAC and Australia are obviously linked, but in terms of it's just going, growth is probably the easiest way to say that. And what do I mean by that? I think over the last few years, how you deliver a service to that market, I think, is probably one of the biggest changes. And what's driving that is what customer segment are you focused on? It really wasn't that long ago, and I appreciate I'm probably showing my age right now. It was only a few years ago where you would build a data center and it would populate every customer, whether it be hyperscale, wholesale, retail. And I think that's what's changed over the last few years. The the design and build and scale and speed required, security requirements, efficiency requirements, connectivity requirements, they change depending on what type of customers you're focused on in that market. So that's the obvious one for me. Providers such as Fujitsu and others are now building for their specific market. The next thing is just the wave of growth and where it's happened. It's literally happened everywhere. So Sydney's now, you know, a very mature market. It's well over, you know, 500 megawatts of load. It's growing exponentially. It has 3 distinct areas or zones within the data center market. It's got its southeast zone, north zone, and west zones. So very, you know, quite an important regional footprint, I suppose, is probably the best way of putting Sydney. And you're now seeing that move down into Melbourne as well. So just the scale of growth is huge over here. And you can see that they're moving into Perth with the upgrade of the subsea cable infrastructure coming in there, which just wasn't there a few years ago. And you're already seeing signs of development and signs of growth out there, whether it be a connection back into Sydney, added diversity into the West Coast, back into Singapore. So you see in Australia being quite an important hub. A number of companies actually have their follow the sun network architecture here, or network ops teams, because we're one of the first countries in the globe to see the sun every day. So it's a good place to deploy your first, you know, your first area to take over your network operations, essentially. So there's a number of reasons why Australia is going through these growths. It's also a very safe, political, stable environment to deploy infrastructure as well.
So that 500 James. So that 500 megawatts, how have you seen that kind of grow over the last couple of years? What's the absorption rate that you're seeing at the total Sydney market on an annual basis?
Yeah, it's a good question. That I think it's gone up significantly over the last sort of 2 to 3 years. I'd say 5 years ago, if any provider was doing a 5, 10, 15-ish megawatt type opportunity, that was very, very, very significant, and not just within the top 2 obvious customers, but we're now seeing that everywhere, in each zone at every given point from multiple customers. So it's not just about the absorption rate in terms of capacity, it's the amount of people buying, the amount of customers wanting to expand in the north zone, in the west zone, and in other cities at the same time. That has also obviously been driven by the amount of supply. So you can't go a day past in Australia without someone building a 100 megawatt data center. I think the planning ahead has definitely been there. The infrastructure has been planned ahead. But at the same time, it's not about what the site's capable of being. It's about the capacity coming online at that given point to meet the demand cycles or life cycle, essentially.
And presumably those 3 zones represent availability zones, right? Or they're kind of
yeah, 2 do. So sorry, mate. Yes, it's 2 do. So two hyperscale zones, and being the west and the north. But then you've obviously got the traditional zone, which is southeast, where the internet backbones have always traditionally come into Australia. You think about, again, not that long ago, since we saying that quite a lot, there was only one route into Australia for all internet connectivity. So, if you ask about one thing that's changed quite significantly over the past few years, is just the injection in investment into subsea cable infrastructure, which has then led to this next evolution of growth. And that's not just in Sydney. There's more cables coming out of Sydney. Southern Cross has been upgraded as well. But this Perth angle as well. So you can now get to Singapore, and the easiest route to Asia is out of the west as well. So that's bred, more innovation and more collaboration, and as a result, more need for data centers and growth.
So when you look at kind of the Melbourne and the Perth markets, where are they? Are they like, 50% of Sydney, or are they kind of, what's that then from a like a megawatt size perspective?
In my view, Sydney is by far number 1 in Australia, and not to offend any colleagues in Melbourne and Perth, of course, but it's just a very mature market, and it has been for quite some time now. So the boom in data centers is still happening, but it's happened. It's continued growth. there's lots and lots of providers here. There's Hyperscale, there's the retail side of things, there's the collaboration side, the focus on the retail with the connectivity options and the services. And you have wholesale providers and niche providers in the middle that might be focused on government customers or enterprise customers only. And then you've obviously got the hyperscale guys, depending on what facility, and that can even go down to what facility you're operating at. So Fujitsu has a hyperscale site in Western Sydney, and there's another 4 or 5 out there as well. So very established market in terms of where the growth's happening. And naturally, that's because of connectivity and where you'd naturally go. It's also the biggest city, which makes absolute sense for it to be here first. But what we are seeing is Melbourne's now waking up. I think Microsoft and Amazon have announced new zones down in Melbourne, and that's now driving that next wave of significant growth down there as a secondary city, not just for diversity, but also for added resilience and consumption of their services down there as well. It's the second city in the country, of course.
So you thinking it's like 200 megawatts, or are you thinking 100 megawatts?
No, it's definitely well over 100. You're probably close to 200 megawatts these days down there. But in terms of what's built versus consumed, it's a little bit harder to qualify. Yeah,
I get that. No, it's really interesting. I mean, we kind of digressed a little bit, but. So if you think about the segments where the demand's coming from, is 70% hyperscale and 30% others, or what are you thinking the demand of the traditional hyperscale operators versus kind of non-traditional?
I think demand, it's a tough one. It really depends on where you're operating. I think what we're seeing in our market is you don't compete with the same other data center provider, every day. It depends on what market you're after or what market you're focused on. Sorry. So hyperscale are by far driving the market. I mean, there's nothing out of the ordinary there, and I haven't said anything untoward. I think in terms of capacity and volume, and that's driving scale and speed and efficiency and everything else in the market as well. But there's still a lot of demand from the enterprise market. It's just not, it's not in the multi-megawatts. And there's 4 or 5 sort of at the top end type customers, cloud providers, or hyperscale above the megawatt, maybe up to the 5 megawatts, that are all very, very, very active and active every year. So if you're in the hyperscale market, there's a lot of competition to meet those loads as well. And I think, so you've got that natural supply versus demand mechanic, which is happening. There's lots and lots and lots of demand. And you've got your time cycle. So providers are trying to plan when they drop their first level of RFS capacity to be able to meet that demand. I think where you've got other providers are the niche providers, and this is if you're in the North Zone, Sydney North Zone, yes, you can do hyperscale, but you're also very targeted towards the wholesale market, and that's quite a big growth market for us alone, and for the industry. And what's the wholesale market? Well, hyperscale and wholesale should be just chucked together. I think it's the large SaaS providers or the secondary cloud providers that still have huge market caps, that are looking to grow infrastructure into Australia, looking for, might be because of sovereignty, it could be because of deployment of architectures, the availability zones in Asia, but likewise, lots and lots and lots of growth around that type of market as well. Or they're specialist in a vertical, such as healthcare or government, and they have to deploy here to do that. And then the retail sector is probably one that's probably going, I would say, contracting rather than growing. The days of low density footprints going in at 3 kilowatts a rack, which was 5-6 years ago now, we don't really do any of that anymore. Anyone want to? It's not good business for a data center provider to do that. But what we are seeing is any type of customer is mirroring the market as a whole, where density is increasing significantly, but floor space is going down in the enterprise market itself.
What sort of density are you getting up to?
Well, our new designs our new design at Western Sydney and Melbourne, so our new hyperscale designs go to an average of 14 kilowatts a rack across the whole floor. Right. And we're even looking already to increase that, to put it in perspective. I think, an average design even 3 years ago was maybe 6 kilowatts a rack. Yes, you can do 30 kilowatts or 40 kilowatts a rack these days, but you can't do 1,000 of them at once. So I think significant increases.
And that's air cooled, is it? Or that's air cooled?
air-cooled, different types of containment, hot aisle, cold aisle, fan walls. It's, people are all looking at different cooling technologies, and we're in the midst of also looking or reviewing, sorry, not to get too far ahead, different immersion and or liquid type cooling architectures as well, because we think, within probably in a 24-month period, this is going to become something that's required in the market.
So just before, I've got two other questions before we go on to some other things. So price range, what's your price range? What's the price per kilowatt that you're seeing in the market?
I probably shouldn't mention the exact price ranges, Dan,
but give me because if I'm in London, right, I kind of know what the prices are in London, kind of know what the prices are in Germany. I think it's interesting to understand what the price is, roughly speaking.
Yeah, I think it's, I'll say the average, there was a well-known number, and I'll say it this way, I'll try not to sit on the fence, but I love the question. In terms of large loads, there was a number of $150 a kilowatt that was per month for floor space. It was there for forever. It's significantly lower than that now.
Right. Okay, interesting. And then the second thing I was going to ask you was, from a COVID perspective, I mean, I think everyone in England wants to be in Australia right now.
I was going to say, I'm almost apologetic.
Yeah, I mean, I can't tell you the conversations I've had and the media coverage about, is it worth trying to get into Australia, spend 2 weeks just to emigrate there permanently? But has that affected the demand in terms of customers being able to get into the country and kind of view sites or deal with or is it all being dealt with by their local teams predominantly?
I think so the demand in terms of customer demand, sales demand has been significant. I think it's probably the same as most countries where there was that next wave of I must procure more data center space immediately because maybe my demand's gone up, whether I'm, it's collaboration service or I must have infrastructure in somewhere else. And it hasn't stopped. But it's not just hyperscale. Like we're seeing it in the enterprise market where a lot of financial markets and those kind of companies are increasing infrastructure, probably to add diversity or resilience at a country level, not just on a technical level. So significant demand across the board. I don't believe.
Can they get in the country? Have you got like remote teams that you're working with to deploy stuff remotely on their behalf and that?
Yeah, exactly. That was the major change. So rather than them flying teams which couldn't get in the country in any way whatsoever, you were using local teams. So where the bottleneck happened was, everyone's using the same local teams. We know what our industry is like, and Fujitsu was kind of protected against that because we have a very, very large engineering base that we can call on in the wider Fujitsu Australia business. So we didn't really see any issues there around demand fulfillment and or supply chain. But at the same time, we were lucky. We just completed our shells or expansion at Western Sydney. So we didn't have an active project of construction going on. And I think that's where the most of the bottlenecks were happening around whether you could get the freight into the country.
And do you get a lot of customers from the wider Fujitsu business? I'm assuming that they're quite a good pipeline for you in terms of the wider Fujitsu.
Yeah, of course. Fujitsu Australia has long heritage in enterprise, defence, government businesses. It's got a long heritage in education and healthcare and retail. So we get some very, very large businesses in Australia that fit those verticals. And it's just been restructured to a vertical focus. So, we do, of course, we fulfill both needs. We do our direct data center only type services, which would be everything from floor space, engineering resources, connectivity and collaboration resources, all the way through to supporting the larger teams in Fujitsu in some of their enterprise bits. And that might be part of a large multi-cloud deployment where we're part of the pie as opposed to the solution itself.
Well, that's interesting. So I'm going to move on now to kind of this thing that there's been a lot of talk about recently and is becoming more of a priority to lots of the operators I speak to. So sustainable digital infrastructure.
Yeah.
And I kind of want to come at it from two parts. A, kind of what your strategy is from a sustainability zero carbon perspective, and then B, what's going on with the Australian grid, because we hear that out of all the grids in the world, your kind of love affair with coal, if you like, is probably somewhat higher than the others. I'm just wondering if there's anything that you can update us on in terms of how you see that changing over the next few years.
Wow, a sidewinder. Thanks, Dan. I'll start with Fujitsu because that might be easier.
Go for that one first.
Yeah, I can actually say that Fujitsu is very committed to sustainability, and I do appreciate everyone says that, but being here for a year, Fujitsu really means it. It publishes a responsible business report, which is transparent. Every year it goes onto our website, people can go and see that, and it looks at all of the things that Fujitsu do from a sustainability, impact, and social responsibility aspect. So it's not just about sustainability in its own right, it's about impact to the environment. One of the great stats we like to talk about is the neighbours. Now, yes, neighbours is very understood in the data centre industry. We neighbours rate all of our data centres first off. So right at the base layer, how efficient they are, publish that transparently, and then we look to improve that. And I know we talk about life cycle management or circularity. We audit our sites annually on everything, on impact, data protection, impact to the people working in them as well. So we're one of the first DC companies to actually be fully neighbours rated. We've actually been on the Dow Jones Sustainability Index nearly 21, I think it is 21 or 22 times, forgive me if I got that one wrong. So very committed to that. And we then, in fact, this month, launched Offsets. So it's an opt-in program to our DC customers around where they want to offset their carbon footprint. And that's now standard across all of our sites. We just recently launched a solar deployment up in our Queensland site, and we're looking to expand that through the footprint, through the data centre footprint this year into Sydney and Melbourne. And that was actually delivered by an Indigenous IT company that supported us there. So that's part of that social responsibility piece coming in there as well. And we're now actually actively looking at bringing renewables into our power provision. That's not quite ready to talk about much more than that, but we are actively looking at that. So when people talk about sustainability, there's multiple different strategies in there to be a sustainable business. And we've also got a zero e-waste landfill policy, and we've been operating that for a number of years, as long as a number of our offices being carbon neutral already. So it's a big theme across the whole business, not just the data center side.
So the zero e-waste, how do you manage that? Is that just, you've just got a very efficient ITAD system, or?
It's all recycling. Yeah, it's so zero e-waste in landfill. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. And then what was that when you say, you said NEB, or you said something that you've got you said you adhere to certain levels of NED across your site. I missed that acronym.
No, neighbours.
Yeah, neighbours.
Yeah, neighbours rating. So neighbours is obviously an efficiency rating. We always talk about.
Is neighbours, is that an Australian rating? Is it? Or?
No, I think it's a global certification, but it's all around efficiencies of buildings and power generation and things like that. So
interesting.
Yeah. So
a new one for me.
Yeah.
And then and I listen. I'm of the view that the compute capacity is required where the compute capacity is, and you're operating in the countries that you're operating in, and the data centers that are operating in somewhere like Norway at a lower cost price and it's more hydropower. That's just the nature of the grid, right? So I'm not casting aspersions against the Australian grid. I suppose when I found out about it, I was a little bit more interested than anything else, given the amount of sun you've got over there and the amount of access to that, why there is so much reliance on coal, and whether there's any movement in Australia at a grid level that you've heard about to kind of change that over the coming years.
Without being too political here, because it's obviously a minefield, I think there's no secret that the power usage in Australia has been a bit traditional for a long time. But renewable is not just about data centers. It's an active project going on in Australia around whether it be hydro, whether it be snowing hydro is a big one, whether it be wind, whether it be solar. I think more specifically to the data center world, it's how do you get reliable power into your site? Critical loads, critical infrastructure. That's the gap at the moment, and I think renewable energy coming into that is a key step forward. How you do that is another one, but then sustainability is not just about where your mains power feed comes in. I think it's one and very important part of that, of course, but also how do you back up your power? It seems laughable.
Oh, and I get you, and I'm assuming that there are PPAs available, and there's a whole host of different ways that you as a data center operator can reduce your net level. I just would, again, it's very hot over there, right? It's a very hot country.
It is. Can't you tell by my tan?
Yeah, with a lot of open space, and I'm just surprised there's not more solar. I'm just surprised that the percentage of grid is not more renewable than it is. That was just
it's a good point. I don't really know how to answer that one, Dan. To be fair, it's a very political item. It's there is actually lots of solar. There is. It's just it's disproportionately small amount of the total footprint.
I mean, I think from an industry perspective, from a data center industry perspective, and it's not just. I don't think it's just across Australia. It's across Asia. Is not as advanced in terms of its renewable energy as say Europe is, right? Scandinavia, for instance. And I think from a capacity perspective, as that develops over the coming years, then that's going to enhance the amount of capacity that's going to come in from compute, etc. But again, last thing I want to do is make you feel uncomfortable, James. It's meant to be a pleasant experience.
Do you know what's changed, Dan? Actually, just to answer the question probably a bit more directly, is the last couple of years. You talk about the last couple of years and what's happening in the data center industry in terms of growth. The last year and a bit, maybe a bit more than that, but not much more. Customers are demanding it, and I think that's the big flip over, as opposed to, hi, I've got a sustainable strategy. You're going to stop winning deals if you don't have one, and I think that will drive the next evolution of change in our industry, when the demand means you must have a strategy and be effective in operating it.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very, very valid point. And I think, other people that I've spoken to have said that historically RFPs, had like 1 out of 10 might have had sustainability in it as part of that RFP process. And now it's more like 8 out of 10 have got it. So I definitely think it's something that's coming. But
imagine in the past, what's your green strategy? That's very old hat these days. They didn't really mean it, but fundamentally today, you are scored on sustainability metrics, and you can't just say you've got one. You must prove it in an RFP. So it's definitely changed.
Yeah, interesting.
Which is it's good for the market.
Well, James, listen, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with me. It's been very interesting to hear about Fujitsu, what you're up to, and I would love to stay in touch and kind of catch up with you in the coming years and see how things are going.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Dan. Pleasure to be here, mate. Thanks.